When I was a teenager, my friends and I had a tradition. Every summer, we would go camping in a remote forest. It was a peaceful place, far from the city, and we loved it because it made us feel like we were in the middle of nowhere with no one to bother us. But there was one summer in particular that made us swear never to return to that forest. It all started like any other camping trip. We arrived in the afternoon, set up our tents, and began gathering firewood. As we explored the area, we noticed something strange. The trees had carvings on their bark. They weren't natural marks, but deep scratches, almost like symbols or strange inscriptions. Some looked like faces with expressions of pain or fear. One of my friends, Marcos, laughed and said it was probably just some other camper playing a prank. But I wasn't so sure. Night fell quickly, and after dinner, we sat around the fire to tell scary stories. As the night went on, the forest became eerily silent. There were no crickets, no owls hooting, just the occasional crack of branches in the distance. At first, we didn't think much of it, but then the whispers started. They were faint, barely audible, like someone was speaking between the trees, but we couldn't make out any words. We looked at each other, waiting for someone to admit they were playing a joke, but no one did. Then Marcos, the bravest of the group, grabbed his flashlight and pointed it toward the forest. When the beam of light cut through the darkness, we saw something that froze us in place. A few meters away, standing between the trees, was a tall, thin figure with eyes that reflected light like an animal's. It didn't move, it just watched us. Its silhouette was unnaturally elongated, and though we couldn't make out its face clearly, we knew it was looking directly at us. Marco screamed and immediately turned off the flashlight. We rushed into our tents, trying to convince ourselves that we had imagined it. But then the whispers came back, this time closer. The voice was guttural, low, and seemed to echo inside our heads. The words weren't recognizable, but we could feel that it was trying to tell us something. Marcos, unable to take it anymore, stepped out of the tent with his knife in hand and turned on the flashlight again. The figure was gone, but in its place, something worse had appeared. The trees around our camp had more of those strange carvings, and this time, they were fresh, newly etched, as if someone had made them while we were hiding in our tents. We didn't sleep at all that night. The whispers continued until just before dawn, when suddenly everything went silent. As soon as the sun rose, we packed our things and ran out of there. When we got back to the city, we checked the photos we had taken during the trip, and among them, we found one that sent chills down our spines. It was a picture of our tent, taken in the middle of the night. But none of us had taken it. And the worst part? In the background, standing among the trees, we could clearly see the silhouette of that tall, thin figure, watching us. We never went back to that forest. A group of university students decided to go camping in a forest famous for its local legends. It was said that a man had disappeared there in the 90s, and since then, his spirit roamed the area, appearing to those who dared to stay in the darkness of the night. The group, consisting of 5 friends, arrived at dusk and set up their tents near a clearing. A cool breeze rustled the leaves, and mist began creeping between the trunks, giving the place a more unsettling feel than they had anticipated. But instead of being scared, they embraced it as part of the adventure. The first night was filled with laughter and ghost stories around a campfire. The atmosphere was light until, in the middle of their conversation, one of them noticed something unsettling. A motionless figure standing among the trees, watching them. At first, they thought it was an oddly shaped shadow cast by the fire, but when one of the guys, Daniel, got up and took a few steps toward the figure, it vanished into the mist without making a sound. The atmosphere grew tense. They tried to joke about it to ease their nerves, but the feeling of being watched never left them. Some went to sleep early, while others stayed awake, keeping an eye on the surroundings, but they saw nothing else. At midnight, Sophia, one of the girls, woke up feeling a cold breath near her face. Her skin prickled instantly. Her heart pounded as she opened her eyes, and in the dim moonlight, she saw a figure kneeling beside her sleeping bag. It had no face, She stifled a scream and squeezed her eyes shut, trembling. When she opened them again, the figure was gone. She immediately woke the others, but when they searched the area, there were no footprints or signs of anyone outside their group. No one went back to sleep that night. They reignited the fire and stayed together until dawn. The skeptics tried to rationalize what had happened, while others were convinced they had witnessed something paranormal. The next day, they tried to convince themselves it had been a dream or a hallucination caused by exhaustion. But when they checked the photos they had taken during the night, their blood ran cold. In every nighttime image in the background, among the trees, or standing behind them, the figure was there, always watching. Javier and Sofia had heard about a national park with hidden caves, perfect for exploring. They decided to spend a weekend camping, far from the city, craving adventure and a break from their hectic lives. Little did they know, the weekend would take a terrifying turn. The first day went smoothly. They set up their tent near a small creek, built a campfire, and spent hours hiking through the lush forest, marveling at the untouched beauty of the area. As the sun began to set, they sat by the fire, roasting marshmallows, laughing, and enjoying the calm. But when night fully descended, a sense of unease settled over them. The forest, which had been so alive during the day, now felt like it was holding its breath. The silence was deep, almost unnatural. Then, as they prepared to retire for the night, they noticed something strange. Around their camp, there were large, distorted footprints in the dirt, too large to be from a bear and too strange in shape to be from any animal they knew. The prints were deep, as though whatever had made them weighed more than any creature they could imagine. At first, they thought it was the tracks of a wild animal, but as they followed the trail, it ended abruptly, without a trace, as if the creature had simply disappeared into thin air. Javier felt a chill crawl down his spine. Maybe it's a bear, Sofia suggested, trying to reassure him, though her voice trembled with uncertainty. But Javier wasn't convinced. Bears don't vanish into thin air. He ran a hand through his hair, looking around nervously. He tried to shake off the feeling, blaming the wilderness for making his mind jump to conclusions. But the sense of being watched remained. As they settled into their tent, a heavy, uneasy silence enveloped the camp. That night, everything felt off. Javier woke suddenly, his heart racing. He heard a deep, labored breath just outside their tent. He tensed, his eyes darting to the small opening of the tent. Was it an animal? A bear? But then, the sound came again, closer this time, and inhuman. It was almost like a whisper, a rasping voice that seemed to come from somewhere far away, and yet so close. I can see you. The words sent a shock of ice through Javier's veins. His stomach twisted. It was not an animal. It was something worse. Sofia stirred beside him, awake now, her breath shallow. She instinctively covered her mouth with her hand to keep from screaming, her wide eyes locked onto Javier's. She too had heard the voice. The air inside the tent felt thick, suffocating. The shadow of a figure loomed outside, stretched and twisted against the fabric of the tent. The figure seemed impossibly tall, hunched, its limbs long and unnatural. It was like a dark silhouette of a man, but there was something terribly wrong about it. Its arms hung far too low, the fingers too long. Its legs were unnaturally thin, bent at odd angles like it didn't belong in this world. Javier froze, his breath caught in his throat. The creature outside seemed to be sniffing the air, as if hunting for their scent. Every fiber of his being screamed for them to run, but he was paralyzed, unable to move. Sofia squeezed his hand, her grip tight, as if to anchor herself to the reality of the moment. They didn't know how long they lay there in the dark, not daring to move, hoping the creature would leave. But as the first rays of dawn touched the sky, the figure disappeared, vanishing as quietly as it had appeared. The silence that followed was suffocating, and they didn't speak as the sun slowly rose. The creature was gone, but the feeling of dread lingered. Without a word, they packed up their things in a hurry, their hearts still pounding. They were about to leave the campsite when Sophia noticed something out of the corner of her eye. A narrow path that led deeper into the woods. A path they hadn't seen before. Javier reluctantly agreed to explore, convinced they had to get out of there. But as they walked, the dense forest around them grew eerily quiet, as though it was closing in on them. The path narrowed, leading them to the entrance of a hidden cave, something they hadn't expected to find on their route out. They entered cautiously, feeling a strange pull, as if the cave was calling them. Inside, the cave was damp and cold, the air thick with the smell of earth and decay. At the far end, an altar made of animal bones, tattered clothes, and strange symbols carved into the stone sent a chill through their bodies. Among the rags, they found a backpack, old and weathered. Sophia opened it, and inside was a tattered ID card. It belonged to a young man who had gone missing 5 years ago. They recognized the name instantly from local news reports. He had disappeared while hiking in this very park. The discovery sent a shockwave of terror through them. The cave, the altar, the bones, they all pointed to something far more sinister than they could have imagined. Javier grabbed Sophia's arm. "We need to leave now." They turned to go, but as they retraced their steps through the cave, something caught their attention. Faint, barefoot prints, fresh, as if someone had passed through only hours before. The prints led deeper into the cave, past the altar into the pitch-black darkness. They stared at them for a moment, their bodies frozen in terror. Without another word, they ran. The cave seemed to close in behind them, as if the very walls were pushing them out. When they reached the entrance, they didn't stop to look back. They didn't stop until they were far, far away from the park. When they reached the ranger station, they told their story. The rangers listened carefully, then went to investigate the cave. But when they returned, they reported nothing unusual. They had found the same tracks, barefoot and leading into the deeper recesses of the cave. But the tracks had vanished just as suddenly as the creatures. The rangers believed the prints were old, but Javier and Sophia knew the truth. The creature, whatever it was, had been watching them. It had followed them, and it was still out there in the shadows, waiting for the next soul to wander too far into the unknown.